preparing for the next macOS, testing in your environment and what's new. And we're really going to talk about two different things. We're going to talk about testing methodologies and how to test and things like that. And then we're going to talk about some of the changes in Catalina that may affect you. For those who don't know me, my name is Robert Hammen. I've been in the Mac admin community for a long time. I think this is my third straight year presenting at PSU Mac Admins. I've managed Macs since before OS 10. I was a consultant for about 10 years, servicing everything from K-12 to small mom and pop businesses to Fortune 500 companies. For the last 3+ years, I've worked at the National Institutes of Health in suburban DC, managing and securing the Mac environment. Typical ground rules of any presentation. If you get a phone call or either some reason you need to leave, feel free to get up and go. Just try not to disturb other people. Make sure your stuff's on do not disturb, silent. I'd like you to hold questions to the end. We should have plenty of time for discussion of questions. And one last thing is don't frantically start scribbling down URLs or try to take pictures of the screen, because the speaker's notes and slides will all be available for download once the presentation is complete. So can I get a show of hands here? And I apologize to the people in the overflow room. Who here is from K through 12? Okay. How about higher ed? A lot of higher ed, okay. What about corporate? Government? A few of us. Okay. So let's talk first about testing. Why do you want to start testing Catalina now? It's not even going to be out until the end of September. Well, testing now gives you the great opportunity to provide feedback to Apple. And one thing, I don't know if you've noticed, for anybody, how many people have actually downloaded and played with Catalina? Fair number of you. One thing to take advantage, if you've taken advantage, we'll talk about the different ways you can get Catalina in a minute, but Apple seems to be listening very much to what its larger volume customers are experiencing with Catalina and the significant changes. So this gives you an opportunity to shape the product, the shipping product. If you don't test until the product ships, the less you're going to be able to affect positive change. It helps you find bugs and issues for Apple. You're doing them a bit of a service, but you're also doing yourself a bit of a service because some of these things may be exclusive to your environment or maybe your workflows. And it also gives you the ability to be ready to support the OS as close to release as possible. So why should you support right away? And I'll bring up this maxim from another professional friend of mine. Woe is me if I deploy before 0.3. That's the way it always used to be, because invariably when Apple would ship an OS, the 80 plugin was broke. There would be numerous things that would not function correctly in the OS. And this is even true going back as far as just Yosemite, not that long ago. But just in general, in the technology industry, our security model has changed. I've seen this in working with, I'm used to working with corporate customers and having to do change management requests and do test groups for an update and get things approved and have a backout plan. And most software companies have now moved to more of an agile sprint-based development cycle where we're going to code furiously for some period of time and then ship. And my wife is a QA engineer. This is what she does in healthcare IT. So I hear all the Kanban boards and all the verbiage dealing with agile and fast methodology. And by the way, education people, I feel you. Oops, sorry, here. The timing of Apple OS updates is not great for early adoption, at least in North America. That end of September ship date for iOS and macOS after the school year starts, not really good. So I understand it may not be 100% relevant to you, but some of the testing methodologies still are. You can adopt it when you're ready. Okay, so let's get back to talking about updates. We regularly see updates. For example, if anybody here uses Microsoft Office for Mac, you know that every month we get a new release of Office. Sometimes with new features, sometimes with new bugs, and typically anytime you contact support from Microsoft, they're going to come up and say, well, what version are you running? Are you running the latest? Likewise, Adobe releases updates on their Patch Tuesday, usually the second Tuesday every month, except that there's critical vulnerabilities. So in other words, every other week for Acrobat. I like the description somebody had of Acrobat. It's a collection of security vulnerabilities that somehow manages to render a PDF. But, and of course, Apple releases new major, the new major macOS release in the fall. The 0.1 update usually drops within the first month with critical fixes. And then every 45 to 60 days after that, we will see the next bug fix release. So there's always going to be a new update coming from Apple, at least until they hit .6, and then we start over with the next version. Another thing that if you've noticed, Apple has tended to, the last couple OS versions, added new functionality in the spring release. Usually that .4 release has some new stuff in it. So the testing that you're doing is something that you can't just do now before the OS ships. It needs to be an ongoing process. So, security. Apple has, the conventional wisdom in the Mac admin community is that Apple always supports what's called the N-2 model, N being the current shipping OS and the previous 2. And if you look back at software patches and Apple's software update page, security update page, you'll see that's in fact the case, at least as of now. What you'll never find documented anywhere on Apple's website is that this is an actual formal policy. And in reality, if you read those release notes, not all fixes are backported to the OS, older OSs. For example, when the initial Intel Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities came out, Apple fixed them for 10.13.2 or 3, I can't remember what it was, did not fix them for El Capitan and Sierra. And there were a lot of Mac admins who were really upset about this because they were getting a lot of pressure from their security folks. And Apple subsequently did backport those fixes to the older OSs, but it was not originally planned, and it was about a month and a half or so after High Sierra had been patched. And for example, the most recent zombie load Fallout fix is the only way to be fully mitigated against it is to be running 10.14.5. So we've kind of changed the security model, going from from this slower, methodical testing, approval, release to the update came out, I'm going to put it on my machine. If it doesn't blow up the next week, we're going to push it everywhere. And the clicker, there we go. Whoops. Back it up. All right, the clicker is misbehaving. If you want to have the most secure Mac, you have to be running the latest OS with the latest app updates, of course. So as David Bowie sang, the rate of change in the OS is increasing. Let's just take a quick look back at the last couple OSs we had. 10.13, that was a really big fundamental change because Apple changed the file system underlying macOS. This caused a lot of ripples. This caused issues with imaging. We could no longer image machines because of the need for firmware updates. If you somehow managed to get the new file system onto a Mac without running the install, that had never run High Sierra without the installer, the Mac had no concept of how to boot from it because it needed a firmware update. This is when Apple began banging the imaging is dead drum. We also had the concept of user-approved MDM, where you had to actually, if you weren't using Apple, DEP at the time, or Apple School Manager, Apple Business Manager now, to have your machines automatically enrolled, you had to click a button in the profiles preferences to approve it. We also had, Apple started making some changes around this time frame with respect to kernel extensions, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. You had to either whitelist these, the user had to go in and click, say, yes, I'd like to allow Symantec to crash my machine, load the kernel extension. Or you had to create a whitelist profile that you pushed to machines. And by the way, that was originally supposed to take effect earlier in the 10.13 cycle, and all the people in the admin community testing and screaming at Apple about it pushed it back to 10.13.4. So this is an example of a situation where people testing this ahead of the game caused changes to be deferred. macOS 10.14 introduced the concept of Privacy Preferences Policy Control, or TCC, Transparency and Consent Control. All the dialog boxes, when you open up Terminal, it says, Terminal would like to access your library folder. And you had to click OK. And you had to figure out how to create these profiles. Jamf has a really nice PPPC utility that'll create the profiles for you. You don't have to be a Jamf customer to use it. If you are a Jamf customer, of course, you can upload the profiles automatically to your JSS. But that's a great tool for creating those privacy profiles. So continuing on this trend, Apple has made some significant changes in Catalina. In 10.15, they've introduced the boot volume becoming read-only. So how do we handle user data? Well, guess what? That's a separate volume. They've expanded those privacy preference policy control to additional folders and volumes and storage volumes. 32-bit processes are dead. Those dreaded kernel extensions are now deprecated, and a whole lot more. So if you pay attention, it seems like there's a plan. They don't necessarily tell you what the plan is, but if you look, you can see the changes that are coming to the OS. What's the one thing that we've all, ever since imaging died, what's one of our biggest pains besides secure boot? How do you get a machine back to a known good state? How do you do that on iOS? You go into settings, erase all content, and the device goes back to just like it's fresh out of the box. Well, hey, we got a read-only boot volume and separated user apps. Can we do that on macOS today? No. What about 10.16? Stay tuned. Talk to your Apple reps. So I think it's pretty fair to say that given the changes that Apple has been making to the OS, they are catering towards enterprise. You've always heard the thing, Apple doesn't care about enterprise. Well, I think that's not actually the case. For one thing, Apple has had good success selling the iPhone into enterprise. Why? Security. Certainly, you can't make the argument that iOS is less secure than Android. And that's a big thing for a lot of organizations. So a lot of organizations have adopted iOS. So what Apple's been doing, if you pay attention to what's going on, is they've been moving a lot of the iOS security concepts over to the Mac. We are going, we got Touch ID, we got the Secure Enclave, we got the T2 chip, Secure Boot, hardware encryption. Another step that Apple's done, and this is something they talked about a little bit in Mojave, and we saw it with some of the Apple News and Stocks app and so on. It is now expanded further and open up to developers, is Project Catalyst. This allows iOS devs to port their apps to Mac. So what a lot of these Fortune 500 and other companies have, they have their own internal iOS apps. Well, now you can easily port those to Mac. So now the Mac, rather than having to deal with, well, our expense and trip planning system runs on Internet Explorer, which they've replaced once they started adding iPhones. All their travel and apps generally got ported to run on iOS. Well, now they can run on macOS. So the Mac becomes less of a second-class citizen in a corporate network. So it's the old step 1, move the security model over. Step 2, allow iOS apps to be ported to Mac OS 3. Step 3, more profit. As Master Yoda said, difficult to see, always in motion is the future. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How do you get Catalina? Well, there's this thing called AirDrop. No, just kidding. Yeah, you should all have that off. When you go to a conference, a couple things you should always do. Number 1, disable AirDrop. Number 2, disable SSH and VNC and turn on your firewall. Okay, how do you get Catalina? The way that most people get it is through the developer program. This requires you to spend $100 a year. You have to have a DUNS number. This can be sometimes difficult for organizations to achieve, to obtain, or at least a pain. This is still a good idea if you are somebody that is actually going to be creating installer packages, because you can do things like you can get an installer signing cert, and you can do notarization of applications and packages. Not everybody needs that, but again, and this is also, if you're somebody who absolutely has to have Catalina the day that WWDC happens, you probably want to pay for the developer program. Conversely, if you just want to wait, the public beta is something that Apple has been doing recently, and they make this available. I think it came available the week of the 4th of July. So it wasn't immediately, but it was within the first month of Catalina shipping. There was I think it was a beta 2 that was made available. You could sign up for that. But what most people should be doing, if you are using Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager, this is a significant change that Apple made with Catalina. Previously, in order to get access to AppleSeed for IT, you had to, beg, whine, know somebody at Apple, buy them beer at Legends, whatever, to get access to the AppleSeed for IT program. they've opened it up now so that anybody with a managed Apple ID has access immediately. What's a managed Apple ID? Well, what's your account you use to log into Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager? That's a managed Apple ID. So if you log in, if you log into the AppleSeed site with that Apple ID, you should have full access to Catalina. And again, this didn't happen right away, but I think it was within a couple of days of the OS release. So those are the official Apple methodologies of getting Catalina, but there's 2 additional ways that you can do so. Greg Nagel, who was presented here at the conference, has written a tool that will actually pull down all the components of Catalina. They're in a software update catalog. It's no longer relegated to the App Store. And so he has this Python script called install macOS. You can actually use it to pull down any installer. For example, the new revised MacBook Air that was released has a new forked build of the OS. There's a new, if you need to provision one of these, you can't just get the latest Mojave installer on it. You have to get the special one for this machine. Using this install macOS tool, you can get a list of all the available installers out there and pull them down. Sometimes you're limited to bring those installers via only the specific hardware they run on. So you can, again, from that GitHub page, you can download that Python script and you can run that command, and it'll actually pull down the Mojave installer on a read-only disk image. There's another method which leverages pretty much the same technology. It's something called seedutil. Rich Troughton, who's another person who has documented or has presented at this conference numerous times, his Stir Flounder blog is infamous. Usually a lot of people at Apple that read it, but he has documented on how to use the seedutil command to set your Mac up to receive beta updates. Make sure you want to do this. Okay, so you've obtained Catalina. Sorry, back in time there a year for a minute. How should you test it? Okay, whatever you do, do not put it on your daily driver, at least not the first beta. You should probably test it on a virtual machine. Virtual machine being something like Parallels or VMware Fusion. Now, this is complicated by the fact that the Catalina beta would not easily install on VMware Fusion, but some people figured out methodology how to do so. It involves actually configuring it like it's a Windows machine for parts of the installation and then configuring it back as Mac. And the link is on that page. Something that's not quite there yet, but will be available at some point. If anybody who's used this previously, a couple of tools. The auto damage is using install macOS to pull down the installer. There's a tool called auto damage that can actually build a never booted base OS. The version that's available on GitHub right now does not support Catalina. The developer has a functional version, but hasn't released it yet. He's on vacation, so I would assume something's going to happen with that soon. There's also a tool called vFuse, which is written by Joe Chilcote, who also presented at the conference here. And this is a tool that will basically take that never booted OS image and turn it into a VMware VM. So you don't even need to go through the installation process. You can build a never booted OS. It helps automate the workflow. Here's a new build of Catalina. I can build an automated workflow that will take that, install the OS, create a VM for me, and I don't have to run around with clicking in VMware Fusion and so on. A couple of tips, and these are just resource links. Testing device enrollment in VMware Fusion. You need to take some, if you're using Fusion, which is what generally I find a lot of Mac admins prefer over Parallels. I don't have a choice. I work for a government. We can't touch Parallels because it's written in Eastern Europe. But Fusion, you will need to make a couple of configuration changes to reflect the board ID and have a serial number of a machine that's in your device enrollment program. And if you're creating a VM that you want to enroll in Jamf Pro, this is a little known tip. When you create that VM in VMware Fusion, by default it'll only assign a single processor core, and Jamf's MDM won't work with that. You need to assign 2. A tip that Josh Wisenbaker posted, which helped me out immensely with testing, running it on a touch bar machine. And I was noticing that there were times when anytime I'd get an authentication dialog box in my Catalina VM, it would sit there and spin for a while. Well, it was because it was trying to read the Touch ID. It was using the same board ID as my touch bar machine, and it was trying to read the Touch ID sensor. So you can disable that by changing that setting from true to false. A couple more things when you're testing device enrollment. Keyboard shortcuts to bring up, when you're at the Setup Assistant window, to bring up the terminal or the console to see what's going on, documented in Chris Collins' blog. And the last thing is the command you can use, when you're testing enrollment and you run into issues and you need to reforce that prompt. National Institutes of Health would like to manage your Mac. When you want to get that prompt to come back up, you can use that sudo profiles renew-type enrollment to get the device enrollment nag window to pop up. Okay, besides testing on a virtual machine, at some point, probably not beta 1, maybe not beta 2, but maybe around beta 3, beta 4, you're going to want to test this on some real hardware. Again, you're not going to want to test this on your daily driver. You want to test this on a machine that's kind of expendable. Something that doesn't have any valid data on it, or if it does, that data is backed up. If the machine is already provisioned and you're not going to do a nuke and pave of it, uninstall your security software. Trust me. Uninstall your security software. That's the stuff that's going to always cause problems when testing betas. And one other tip, if you're signed into iCloud of that machine, you might want to sign out. A lot of developers are finding, who actually use iCloud to do data storage and synchronization, are finding major problems, or at least their customers are having major problems, if they're testing iOS 13 or Catalina, because there are some upgrades that happen on the iCloud back end that are causing them problems with earlier OSs, be it iOS or macOS. So you may want to sign out of iCloud proactively as a security measure. So notes about releasing subsequent betas. First of all, don't expect everything Apple to work correctly. I know a lot of people have had problems with using the App Store to install or update apps on Catalina beta machines. Don't expect software update to do a successful update. I had that problem with beta 2 to beta 3. It would just sit there and hang at a black screen. I ended up re-downloading the beta 3 installer and performing a reinstall. If that didn't work, I was prepared to nuke and pave my test hardware. When you're testing, especially when you're testing a machine that's already upgrading a provisioned machine or a machine that's been upgraded a few times, if you find something that you think is a bug, see if you can reproduce it before you submit it. Not everything is a bug. Sometimes it's the process that's caused the problem, or maybe it's something legacy. So try to replicate that on a fresh system or a nuke and pave. Some awesome resources that are available on that AppleSeed for IT site. Apple has test plans where they say, go in and try this. Bind this machine to 80, do this, do this. They're looking for feedback in specific areas where there may be changes. Again, every environment is different. So the more that you can contribute, the better and more stable we can make macOS. There are also discussion forums you can post the questions. Is anybody having a problem with X? And again, since these are hidden behind a login, you can discuss things outside of the NDA. One other thing that Apple posted, and I'm not being sarcastic when I say it's awesomely well done, they did a really nice job with this What's New for Enterprise and Education PDF, highlighting all the changes that are coming in Catalina and iOS. You really want to have access to this. You really want to see this. So the betas will keep coming. There's a cadence to these. Again, we're into this agile development cycle with development sprints. About every 2 weeks, we see a new beta. And again, avoid the temptation of updating your daily driver, at least until we get a lot closer to shipping. I know many of you. I know a few people who have updated their daily drivers, and I know at least some of them have regretted it. And the clicker is acting up. Okay, couple things. Whoever your MDM provider is probably not going to have a compatible version until the date that Catalina ships. Well, they will offer day 0 support. Hopefully they don't offer 0-day support, because that's not really something anybody wants, but there's a big difference between those two. If you absolutely need to test something that's in the new MDM functionality, Apple does give you access to Profile Manager or macOS Server Beta. Not really a good idea to use that for much of anything other than testing, but it is there. So this is a good time. If you don't already have a runbook to document your provisioning process, this time of year when a new OS comes out, it's always a good idea to have this documented. What changes do you make to a system when you're setting it up? What software gets installed, what configuration profiles are deployed, what security settings are changed. Because chances are, with these major OSs, sometimes the things you try to change are no longer changeable. Apple does keep expanding the system integrity protection. For example, I know I personally have been guilty of doing things like have a self-service policy that will rebind your Mac to AD if the bind is broken. It'll just go in and like nuke library preferences, the directory service. And guess what? In Catalina, that's now protected by SIP, so that'll no longer work. So again, having things documented in a runbook is a really good idea. Something you can do while you're doing your testing, because it'll also reinforce things that you need to test. Hey, our provisioning process does these things. I've just provisioned a new Catalina machine. Did it do these things? You definitely want to test with device enrollment, both on a non-T2 Mac first to get your process through, as well as on a machine with the T2 processor. If you don't have a T2 Mac, you need to get one, at least one as a test machine. What makes a T2 Mac special? Well, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I'll just hit the highlights that are relevant here. T2 machines has 2 OSs installed on them. There's macOS and BridgeOS. There is some synergy between these two because these two OSs communicate with each other. So when you update macOS, there's always a BridgeOS update available, at least if Apple publishes it. And T2 machines typically have external boot disabled by default. You can't net boot them. You can't hold the option key and boot off an external drive, at least unless you boot into recovery and use the boot security utility to change that setting. So when you're testing on a T2 machine, if your beta OS goes south, you might have a brick. You may be able to recover it using a beta version of Configurator to reload BridgeOS. One pro tip suggestion, I actually got this from Apple, was that you should, before you install Catalina on a T2 machine, create a new APFS container and either install your current OS on that as a backup or just install the new OS on that container. Now, if you install it in a container, one thing that's kind of neat is each Mac has both the boot volume and a recovery volume. If it's a separate container, you still have your 1014 boot and recovery, and then you have your 1015 boot and recovery. If your 1015 OS goes south, you can hold the option key down at boot and select a functioning OS to get your machine back bootable. Again, if you get yourself in that situation where the machine is unbootable and external boot is disabled and you don't have internet recovery, you might be in trouble with that machine. Or if you have BridgeOS go south on you, you might be taking it to a Apple Store or for hardware repair. Okay, something you want to do, test your applications. Identify, and this hopefully is identified in your runbook. What applications do you use? Do the applications work? Do they function correctly? And again, I recognize those of us in IT may not be the ones who would answer that latter question, but at least you can first say, does the app crash? There is a public site called Roaring Apps. It's actually been around since macOS Lion. That's hence the name Roar, the Roar reference. That has a listing of user-provided reports of these things. This works, this crashes, etc. Also suggested you do something like this. Emily Costlake-Whittle put together this template for technical readiness, where they identified what apps are available on the system, who in their organization is responsible for the app. Does it work? They just do this as a simple Confluence page. You can do this as an Excel spreadsheet or whatever you want, but just some method of identifying what applications are important to you as an organization and whether they function. Okay, if you have scripting as anything you do, whether it's self-service policies, initial setup, whatever, you need to test these scripts for multiple reasons. Number one, and we'll talk more about this later, there are some changes coming to scripting languages that are included in the OS, and the default Unix shell is changing on Catalina. And we'll talk about that when we get into the what's new in Catalina section. Okay, your security tools. Remember, I advised you to uninstall them before upgrading. Like your MDM vendor, you're probably going to be waiting for your security tools to ship right around a compatible version, hopefully by the time that Catalina ships. If Catalina has shipped and your security tool vendor still can't give you a date of when they're going to have a functional version, this is a clue that it's time to find a new security vendor. This process of Apple releasing OS every year has been going on since 10.7. We're now at 10.15, so that's 8 years or 9 years. This is not a new process. If that security vendor is not geared towards being able to support what Apple is doing, they're not really committed to the platform. Okay, besides testing yourself, as we get closer to the release in September or so, if you're trying to provide day zero support, you're going to need to identify some early adopters, people who actually use these machines. And I wish I could give you some sage advice about being able to identify them. It's more of an art than a science. Generally, you want to find people that don't hate change and have the ability to communicate and follow directions. Okay. So now you've tested and you've found some bugs. You want to report them to Apple. In the previous days, it was known as a radar. You'd go to BugReporter.apple.com. And this is the circle of a bug report's life. You would maybe contact Apple Care Enterprise and say, I found this problem, and they would say, please file a radar. So you'd write the information up, and they would say, please attach the sysdiagnose. So you do all this work, and you come back, and you get marked as duplicate, and then you never have any window to what's going on with that bug ever again. Well, the good news is that Apple has deprecated the old BugReporter radar system. The new method of reporting bugs, both on macOS and iOS, is the Feedback Assistant app. On macOS, it's hidden in your System Library Core Services Applications folder, but you can just Spotlight search for feedback. And it still has a historical record of any previous bug reports that you submitted. So what does this tool look like? Well, it pretty much looks like this. So again, I'm providing feedback for macOS. I'm saying where is this about? What is it? What technology area? What's the issue you're reporting? And then you can write a description. And if you notice at the bottom, it says collecting two diagnostic files. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So how do you write a good bug report? Well, it's kind of like anything you do for example, when you're writing communications to users or documentation that's user-facing, you have to take yourself and put yourself in the mindset of somebody who isn't intimately familiar with your environment and your configuration, what you're trying to do. First thing you should do, please provide an accurate subject. This OS is screwed. That doesn't help. The number one thing you should do, what are you trying to accomplish? Because you may be so heads down in this process that I've done it this way all the time, and I'm so used to doing it this way, and it doesn't work anymore. But what are you actually trying to do? Because maybe there's a better way of accomplishing it. And helping Apple understand that can help them point you in the correct direction. Please write as detailed as possible, in as little space as possible, an explicit description of the issue. Identify whether is this a new problem, or is this something that used to work and it now doesn't? Is it a regression? Are you able to reproduce this problem? Have you tried it in other hardware? What are the steps you took to reproduce that? Screenshots are great. Full error messages are great. Whip out your iPhone and take a video of what's going on if that helps. If anything you're doing involves a script or code or a test case please include that as well. The full error message, if there is one. You can look at the console logging. What was your expected result? What was the actual result? Did you identify a workaround to this problem? And lastly, and this is the important one, especially if this is something significant, if it's a significant impact, how many potential systems does this affect? I've had to do this where I've had to go to Apple and go, yeah, this bug with software update and not installing the updates correctly and shutting systems down is affecting like 27,000 systems, and we really need to get this fixed because it's bad. So when we looked at the screenshot of the feedback assistant, you saw it was collecting diagnostic information. How many people are familiar with sysdiagnose? Okay, so you've had to do a sysdiagnose. There's a couple different ways you could accomplish this before. You could run the sudo sysdiagnose command, or you could hold down Control Option Command Shift period, and it would chew for a while and create a very large log file that Apple would ask you to send to them. This is now something that is automatically done for you when you create a case in Feedback Assistant. Now the caveat to that is if you were in a high security environment, you know, like a .mil address or something like that, or you're in an air-gapped environment, you may not want to send that information to Apple because that may include information about your network. You may not be allowed to send that. So just keep that in mind, that you may not even be able to use Feedback Assistant. And talk to your Apple SE about that. T2 machines make sysdiagnose even more fun. Because the T2 and the Mac spend a lot of time communicating sysdiagnose information and creating multiple sysdiagnoses for both BridgeOS and CoreOS. Duo Security had a really great article. It's way too technical for this class, but if you really want to learn more about it, you can search on their website for it. Okay, if you run into something that is a critical bug, like the aforementioned issue that I had with software update, number one, when you're filing these bugs, please do so using your managed Apple ID. That's the one, again, that you would use to log into Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager. And again, that doesn't mean you have to use that same like master account. You can create additional accounts for yourself just with your email that are, you know, that have those privileges. As long as you're not a student, you can have access. If you create just a regular Feedback Assistant, it goes to more of a general queue. If you're signed in with a managed Apple ID from Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager, it goes to a more focused group of people that are going to pay a lot closer attention to, you know, larger organizations' issues. If you have AppleCare's enterprise support, create a ticket. Once you've done both of these things, send the IDs of your feedback and your AppleCare case to your SE and say, hey, this is a problem. And SEs do have an escalation path to get critical issues fixed. It may be on their radar. They may already be planning to fix it, but if they're not, they can escalate it. A couple of critical links. The first one is really awesome because, and I had not actually seen this until a few days ago. It's basically a way Apple has on their developer website. They redid a lot of their documentation recently, and it's pretty good. But there's a whole bunch of logging information and logging profiles that you can download for specific areas. For example, directory services, Bluetooth. How do I get some of that logging information? And the instructions are on that URL. And again, and if the second one is requires developer login, more information about sysdiagnose. So that concludes the testing part of the. Now we're going to talk about what's new in Catalina. And the biggest change is to the Mac file system. As I mentioned earlier, when you install Catalina on a machine, it actually carves off a new section, new container, and puts the OS on it and deletes the OS from the previous one, renames the old hard drive makes it a data volume. So now you've got a lot of the applications that Apple shipped used to be in /applications. Now they're buried in the system folder. You thought you understood all the different library folders and applications folders on the OS, and guess what? They just pulled the rug out from under you and changed everything. But they've added a new feature to APFS called firm links, and this allows the Finder and terminal to display as one. Your applications folder in the Finder looks just like it did on 10.14. But in reality, the Apple-approved apps live one place. The apps that you install as a user live another place. When you start talking about things like library extensions or /etc, it gets even more, it gets a little more nebulous. So there's a lot to grab there about changes to the file system. Part one. Part two, some of those things are still changing. There's even been some bugs where, for example, you click on the applications in the sidebar and it'll show you just the system applications, not all of them, and Apple tells you, oh, just delete and recreate that alias. So don't make assumptions. The explicit paths to some of these applications obviously have changed as they've been moved. I have seen some oddball things happen in terminal. I have seen some oddball things happen with scripts. Some of these may be bugs. Some of these may be problems in my scripts. I did see somebody having a problem where they did not uninstall a security tool. It was giving them problems on Catalina. They were trying to boot into single user mode and uninstall it, and they couldn't figure out how. And it was because their external drive, or the data drive, was not mounted read-write. They had the boot drive mounted read-write, but they were trying, it got kind of involved, trying to troubleshoot. So, and this was mentioned by Mike Boylan earlier, that, for example, if you're an organization that uses NFS, being a big Unix shop like me, if you tend to mount things at /, not possible right now in Catalina. Will be in a future version. So again, if you think that this segregation of the OS into a read-only volume, which again should provide for more security, that volume is read-only, and apps and user data is going to allow you today to do an erase and install and not wipe your home directory, guess again. Because if you use the erase and install option, it will. Today, will that behavior continue in a future OS? I don't think it's going to happen in a point release, but what are we going to be discussing next year? And one interesting thing, right now, OS upgrades are an actual installation process, which can take upwards of 45 minutes, depending on hardware. We're actually installing an OS, and if the installer has a bug or a hiccup and something doesn't get installed correctly, one of the advantages of going to a read-only OS is that it allows to make that a container that can be just replaced. No, that's not imaging. We still have firmware issues to worry about. But just like you can download an IPSW file, if you got an iPhone that's like not working, you can plug it in and just copy the OS on it. Wouldn't surprise me if we had that same ability on macOS in a future version as well. Just speculating. Okay, big thing for macOS, supervision. Everybody familiar with the concept of supervision on iOS devices? It's company owned. This will only happen if your Mac was enrolled via automated device enrollment. If you had your machine in Apple School Manager, but you didn't create a pre-stage in your MDM, and you enrolled it, and then you went and user-approved MDM'd it, and you upgrade that machine to Catalina, it is not going to be supervised. If you go back and wipe that machine and you go through a pre-stage and it gets the automatic, this Mac would be managed by the National Institutes of Health, it will be. You can think of the two different kinds of MDM enrollment. Again, automated device enrollment, what we used to call device enrollment program, or DEP. That's now a verboten language from Apple. And then user-approved MDM. You could think of one as automatic MDM or manual MDM. There's a lot of things in Catalina that you're only granted if you have automatic MDM. So this is the usual yearly kick in the pants to get all your Macs in Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager. You're able to verify if a machine is supervised either through the System Profiler app or through the System_Profiler command line tool. Something new for T2 machines only, activation lock, just like on iOS. This allows if the Mac is stolen, basically nobody can do anything with it. It becomes, the machine is locked. Again, this is one of the features that requires it to be in the automated enrollment. It also requires the Mac to be supervised. So again, we have to meet that previous criteria. And your MDM when upgraded to support this, can support activation lock escrow. But there are some caveats. If you have machines that meet these criteria in the field right now, and you're not blocking Find My Mac, and a user's never signed in by Find My Mac, you're okay. I mean, you could have a problem. You need to get people to sign out of Find My Mac, and you need to potentially block. You can restrict that with a macOS restrictions profile. The problem is if the person doesn't sign out of Find My Mac first, and you push the profile, you've actually removed their ability to log out of it or to disable it, because it disables the interface and not the actual functionality. So this is going to be a point that people are going to have to watch when they do Catalina upgrades. Okay, Apple has done some significant expansion to privacy preferences policy control. You're going to get a lot more prompts. Anything that's trying to access your desktop folder, your documents folder, your downloads folder, your trash even. Any cloud storage vendor you use, whether it's iCloud Drive, Dropbox, Box, Google Drive, etc. Any external drives you attach to the system. Any process or application that tries to access them is going to throw a prompt. You will also see prompts for things like access to the camera. So there's a lot of the Zoom vulnerability that's been a big topic of discussion this week. It should be mitigated. Access to the microphone, input device monitoring, i.e. keyboard logging, screen capture, speech recognition, and this is a big one right here, network shares. Now again, if I mount a network share and I double-click an Excel document in the network share, I'm not going to see a prompt. But if you were a Jamf site and you use distribution points that are still SMB, not HTTP, Catalina is going to give you some problems. You need to get yourself to be using HTTP or HTTPS or Jamf Cloud. And yes, I know if you're on Windows, installing and configuring IIS is a giant pain in the butt. But SMB distribution points are going to be a problem for you with Catalina because you're going to get prompts that you'll either need to work around. Okay, the big news. KEXTs are dead. Well, sort of. Apple has slowly been tightening the noose on kernel extensions. Kernel extensions run at the kernel level. They run very deep in the operating system. And they tend to cause a lot of problems, both performance and stability. Because they run so low in the operating system, first of all, they take up memory that can't be swapped to disk. So they're eating up part of your system resources, number one. Number two, a lot of things that need to go through them, they're always intercepting, which again, may be a desirable function for a security product, but maybe not for a printer driver or something like that. What I've seen in a lot of high security environments is checklist security. We need X. Well, we'll buy this product and install it on Mac and Windows. We need Y. Well, buy this, install it. So suddenly you get agent fatigue. You know, here's a new out-of-the-box Mac. It runs great. Let me put all the mandated security software in it. Look at these 7 agents on here. This thing runs slow. What the heck happened to it? So, as I mentioned earlier, Apple's been tightening the noose. You used to be able to write KEXTs, install them in machines, no problem. Then Apple said, well, they have to be code signed. So you have to be an Apple developer to actually do this. Okay. And they said, well, they have to be approved by the user-approved MDM, or the person has to whitelist them. Then they had to be notarized. Now Apple is saying 10.15 is the last version of macOS where KEXTs will run without compromise. They're really trying to push all these security vendors to use new things. So what replaces KEXTs? System extensions, or sex. Well, maybe not. We'll call them sysxs, not sex. That might not be a good idea. This is part of the new driver kit in macOS Catalina. It runs in the user space, not at the kernel. And these sysxs are typically part of an app bundle. They're kind of like extension share sheets that you no longer have to worry about library extensions. When you install something and it puts files over the file system, it's kind of contained in the app bundle. The OS will still load it. So it's easier for you to manage. Apple's been adding frameworks to the OS over the last several versions. They added a VPN framework several versions ago, and they encouraged a lot of the VPN vendors to use this in lieu of writing their own kernel extensions. They've added a hypervisor framework and encouraged a lot of the virtualization people to use this in lieu of writing their own KEXTs. They now have a security framework, which is designed to provide functionality to security tool vendors. But again, they're not going to be able to, hopefully not be able to compromise the entire OS. One more change that Apple did to kind of tighten the noose on KEXT a little bit, and this is different behavior than any previous OS. When you install a KEXT, something that has a KEXT on it, on Catalina, that KEXT is not loaded until the machine is restarted. And I've seen this happen too, where people are doing testing, like, hey, I installed my security tool and it didn't blow my machine up. Oh yeah? Restart. What happened? Boom. Okay. Apple has made some significant changes with respect to Gatekeeper and Notarization. With Gatekeeper, generally an application was only checked once at first run. Now that check happens on every launch. Notarization is something that came out in macOS Mojave. It's kind of what you can think of notarization is this is proof that an application was sent to Apple and it was run through an automatic malware scanner service that Apple has. Kind of like VirusTotal, if you ever use that. Again, in 10.14.5, they required KEXTs that were compiled after a certain date to be notarized. They also required new developer IDs to notarize their applications. macOS 10.15 has some additional notarization requirements. We could spend an entire session talking about this. As a matter of fact, if you stay in this room, Tom Bridge is going to do a notarization session ever. And I had a preview of some of the stuff that he's learned, and you definitely want to see this if this is a point of interest to you. You want to stay here. The default Unix shell has changed on macOS. Now, it's gone from bash to ZSH. If you upgrade your machine, it's not going to change your default shell. You can use the chsh command to change the shell if you want. But if you set up a new machine, you're going to get ZSH as a default. Why did Apple make this change? Well, ZSH is newer. It's not based on the new GPL license. Your existing scripts will still run. You will probably want to start learning the differences. There are some good ones and some bad. I've got a couple of resource links up here. Armin Briegel, who runs the Scripting OS 10 site, which is really a great site if you've never looked at it. Even if you don't script on OS 10, it's a great site because he'll do a weekly news summary for Mac admins of developments. But he's got an 8-part series he's doing on moving to ZSH. Okay, Apple has made some changes with scripting languages. Things like Python and Perl and Ruby. Apple has said that we are not going to guarantee that these are going to be installed in a stock OS in the future for multiple reasons. First of all, that's an attack surface. Does your dad really need a Python interpreter on his Mac? Only if he's writing code in Python, or you're writing code in Python that he has to run. Python 2.7 is end of life and will be dead as of January. So Apple's going to yank that. And Apple hasn't updated the version of Python 2.7 in a long time. Python 3 today installs on demand. If you've ever had to use you tried to use a command that you need the Xcode command line tools, you got a prompt to install, it's the same thing that happens with Python. Ruby and Perl are probably going to go that same route down the road. They're shipping in the betas right now, but that may change at any point. This is not dissimilar to what Apple's done in the past when they pulled things like Java out of the OS and you had to go to Oracle to get it, or they pulled Xports, X Window System out, and you had to go to get that separately. They still work. I don't believe that scripting and automation on macOS are going away. It's just the defaults are changing. If you need to ensure that if you have Python scripts as part of your setup process, you need to figure out how to get Python on those machines or ship the runtime with your scripts. Okay, this is a new feature. One of the big pain points that a lot of Mac admins had with the APFS transition was something called Secure Token. I can hear the groans. Secure Token was this circle of trust thing that when you set up a new user on an APFS Mac, the first user, the setup system, got a secure token. And this basically gave them the keys to unlock the disk if you enabled File Vault. Subsequent users that logged in needed to be granted this secure token, which usually involved a process of, it would require the first user's password to get this, and it got really convoluted, and people like myself wrote these really oddball scripts and were passing script, local admin usernames and scripts and kind of fretting about the security over that. So this is something that Apple has come out with for people who are still binding to AD and creating mobile accounts, and it's basically an MDM escrowed ability to hand out secure tokens to people. It doesn't work, it's not super flexible in its current implementation, and it's not something that they really documented or talked about yet, but it is something that's new in Catalina. And again, this is another one of those new features that requires the automated device enrollment MDM, not the user approved. Apple has done a nice job with some of the zero-touch improvements to the OS. Being able to do the branding. If you saw any of the Apple presentations where they showed about being able to put your organization logo if you're doing the out-of-the-box setup, people have to click OK to the acceptable user policy. Integration with some third-party directory services where they're using Jump Cloud, Okta, Ping, Duo, etc. How many people here are familiar with either Enterprise Connect or Jamf Connect? So this has been a trending thing. Apple's had Enterprise Connect for a while, and what it has been is a tool to let you basically have not bind your Macs to AD. You create a local account on your Mac that would synchronize its password with AD and get Kerberos tickets. It's another way to get around some of these secure token and other AD binding issues. The only way you got it is if you engaged Apple Professional Services and paid $5,000 and they came on site for 2 days and did a setup. And a lot of people said, well, hey, if this is so great, why don't you build it into the OS? Well, they kind of did. It's not the full Enterprise Connect, but what they're providing is an extension for single sign-on for Kerberos. And it gives you the ability to sign in so that you have a Kerberos ticket and you can access those resources, be they websites, shared printers, Office 365, with a Kerberos ticket from a user account that's not an AD account, it's a local account. It's configured entirely via MDM. There's a link to the profile example in the notes. There's still room for third-party tools like Jamf Connect because there's things more than just Kerberos that you want to do. Whether, again, it's those aforementioned Ping, Okta, Jump Cloud, whatever identity service provider you're using. So miscellaneous changes to the OS. 32-bit apps are truly dead. Apple's been saying this for a while, and now they actually are gone. You'll get an error dialog box if you attempt to launch any of them. And I know this might affect education more than anybody. Any scripts or any tools used that run the FDE setup command, the user is going to get a prompt to authorize or deny. This is an anti-malware approach on Apple's part. They're going to be pushing people to do file vault enrollments via MDM. Similarly, one thing that a lot of the bad actors have been able to do is convince people to install something on their machine and end up actually enrolling their Macs in an MDM by pushing a profile, using the profiles command. So what Apple has announced is that being able to install profiles using the profiles command, which is something that tools like Monkey or Puppet or Chef can do today, will not function that way in a future version of the OS. They're going to tighten the screws down on that hole a little bit further. A couple more miscellaneous changes. There are some trusted certificate changes in cert chain. There's an Apple KB article on that. And the big one that caught a lot of people off guard is printer drivers are deprecated and will stop working in a future version of cups. This is the way most IT admins feel about printers anyway. What does it actually mean? Well, the kind of printers that we've used before, LPD, Socket, JetDirect, Apple's pushed towards AirPrint for years, which is based on advanced IPP. So if you're using a modern printer, there'll be some changes. You won't be able to, you may need to install some additional software to make your printers work. More to be determined. It still works in Catalina today, but changes are on foot. How many people watched or heard about the WWDC session on what's new in the file system where one of the Apple engineers talked about imaging? So is imaging dead? Yes, it's still dead. There's a specific use case where being able to image a file system is possible, and that is if I am reinstalling the same OS that's currently running on a machine. All my machines are on 10.14.5, and I want to put a new 10.14.5 on them, I can do that. Again, the reason why imaging is truly dead is because of the lack of firmware updates. Every OS update that Apple ships, minor or major, will update the firmware of your Mac. Many of these firmware updates are required in order to actually run that OS version. If I'm able to put 10.14.5 on a machine that's running 10.14.0, I guarantee that machine will have problems. It's just the tight integration between firmware and OS, and especially, again, on a T2 machine with Bridge OS. So again, please do not be convinced that imaging is coming back, because it is not. Okay, concluding, my friend Tom Bridge wrote a really great blog post. For those in auto racing, what does waving the green flag mean? Go! WWDC every year is Apple waving the green, is it time for us to wave the green flag? It's a time for change. Change can be good, but it's time we do our jobs and earn our pay as people, engineers, people who are adopting Apple's technologies into our environment and adopting our workflows to support the direction that Apple is going. And with that, that concludes my part of the presentation. Now we have time for questions. You guys got the catch box? Okay. Wow. Somebody's got to have a question. Yeah, I was going to say, the poor people in the overflow room.
They need to send a runner.
Yeah. You can Slack me at Robert Hammen, and I'll take a look.
Okay, this thing is on. You said testing. How are you actually doing your testing app-wise? What framework are you using? What script are you using to open those apps, test those apps on this OS, to act like you're sitting there clicking the buttons and seeing, do the programs actually work? Open and close is not considered testing.
Right. And to some of that extent, you know, generally what I found is that when there are things that don't work, it's part of the provisioning process for me. That's, you know, those are the things that I can control. Whether Microsoft has a version of Office that works on Catalina is something I can't necessarily control. But I trust Microsoft's aware of it. They're a big enough vendor. Most of the testing and the things that I'm involved in doing are in all those steps of getting the machine and getting the OS on it and getting the apps on it and getting it configured the way that we configure machines, and then seeing what doesn't work, what is broken. Once I get that machine to a point where it's functional enough to test those applications, yeah, I will sit there and again, I'm not somebody who lives in Excel all day, but I can certainly open up Excel, I can create spreadsheets, I can test printing and things like that. At some point, and this is where, again, where early adopters come into play, at some point you're going to want to have other people who live in Excel on a daily basis. And again, this is part of the identifying people who make good testers. You're going to want to have somebody who does this jump on the train early. And when I say early, I don't mean July or August. I mean like early September, when the software gets GM or close to it. For example, I know that Microsoft has released some updates that have addressed bugs in Catalina. So, you know, I mean, why make that, you know, trying to find those early adopters is challenging enough anyway. If you make it really painful for them by getting them looped in real early, they're going to get a lot of testing fatigue. So you need to consider the timing on when you actually push it down there. But
If Apple is going to deprecate the profiles command, do you get the sense that there is still going to be a method for gently enrolling a machine that's already out there?
Yeah, but it'll probably be enrolling it through MDM, or going to a portal.
So without having to nuke it, basically.
Yeah. I don't think you should conflate the two. There are ways to enroll machines, already existing machines, that don't involve using the profiles command. Maybe it's an installer package, a quick add package, like Jamf does in their terminology, or an enrollment page.
I don't know if this is going to work.
Yeah. I remember one throw, I got a laptop screen and a water bottle in the same throw.
That's a good throw. So I work in a high security environment, so I feel you when you say 7 security agents on a computer. But when it does come time for the new machines to get delivered with Catalina, and inevitably security companies are not going to be ready, and you need machines to come in, what kind of advice do you have for somebody in that situation?
Well, yeah, and that's a point that I didn't address in my slides, that I think at some point I intended to. There's usually about a 30-day window of time between the time that the OS ships and that all new hardware starts showing up with it. And generally, especially on the newer hardware that's all T2 and BridgeOS, it's harder to go back. I mean, we've sort of been spoiled by the ability to downgrade on macOS. Since Apple's adopted the iOS security model toward macOS, can you downgrade your iOS device? Maybe not right, maybe right away after an update comes out for a day or two, but that's about it. So when Apple ships those machines with the new OS, downgrading is going to be less and less likely. So you have to actually be a bit proactive in your budget and procurement planning. You've got to sit there and say, okay, I'm not going to be ready to adopt Catalina until January. I'm going to probably need about 30 systems between October 1 and January. So I better make sure my procurement people order enough systems that I can stockpile. And there are some, actually, there's enough of a market for this where there are actually some vendors that will buy and sit on, like CDW, and that will actually buy and sit on stocks of hardware, and then of course they will charge you full list price for the machines and not give you a discount because they're sitting on them, but at least they're available to you. I've actually seen organizations where they've gone on eBay and bought used systems, which is not exactly a great idea from a security perspective. But whoa!
I tried, sorry. Okay, so maybe I misunderstood. I just wanted to revisit what you said about supervision, and I'm coming from an enterprise environment. So my understanding was if our devices are user approved or DEP. So I also want to clarify what you said about, is it not DEP anymore? I mean, I'm still.
Yeah, so just to clarify a couple points there. Apple has changed their terminology. They've gone from DEP to device enrollment to automated device enrollment. We're really still talking about the same thing, but basically that's the process where your machines are in Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager. When you provision them or take them out of the box to set up, you've got them in a workflow where you get the prompt that says this machine can be managed by, and you say accept. If you go that workflow, you are in what's called the automatic MDM, if you will. You may have machines that are in your Apple Business Manager, but you go through an enroll later workflow, or you image the machines, or somehow get software on the machines, and you have to go into the profiles preference and approve that MDM profile. That's a manual. That's the important distinction. There are a lot of new features in Catalina that are only relevant to machines that have gone through the automatic setup. So there's a lot of people that have machines that are in, if they were to take that machine and wipe it, it would get reprovisioned the automated way. But it was set up a while ago, the manual method. And those machines that are currently not going to get automatic supervision and some of the additional, like the BootStrap tokens and the activation lock, all that stuff that's gated behind the automatic MDM will not be granted to those systems unless they are nuked and paved today. Now, this is a perfect example of where you file a feedback assistant on that. I have 1,500 machines that were set up the old way. They're all here, but I'm going to have to nuke every one of these in order to be able to take advantage of supervision and all these features in Catalina. What the heck? And that's where you, again, feedback assistant, you may not get a great response from that, but at least file it with an impact statement. If you have AppleCare Enterprise, file it. Ping your SE with both case numbers, and again, repeat that impact. The more that Apple hears that this is a problem, the more likely they're going to be able to change it. I don't know if it'll be something they can do by the time that Catalina ships, but I know it's feedback that a lot of others have given them, that this is not great. It'd be nice if it could, it'd be nice if there was some way, because the machine is in the user-approved MDM and it's the same MDM for the automated, if there would be like a one-time exception where we could say, hey, these are the same, I'm going to treat it like it was full and do the supervision. But trust me, Apple has thought of this. They have reasons why a lot of these things don't. They may not explain those reasons to you, but they have reasons.
Okay.
So my question is then, if you go through supervision, common practices when MDM frameworks break is to re-enroll them. If you do like a Jamf enroll after supervision's already done, does that break supervision?
I don't think so, but that's something you got to test. And again, that's something you may need to wait until Jamf announces their day 0 support. It'd be nice if Jamf MDM broke less often.
We have a reseller who they're upgrading their POS system, but currently they don't offer auto enrollment. What's the solution for not necessarily like our existing machines that haven't been enrolled, but going forward, if the reseller you purchased through doesn't offer auto enrollment?
So what would be really nice is if Apple would adopt what they do in iOS, which is the provisional enrollment, where you could use Configurator to hook a machine up to a Mac, and then you would have that and enroll it, and then you'd have that 30 days to be opted out before it officially rolls into your MDM. This is yet another example where you file a feedback assistant on that enterprise case, email your SE, and state the impact. These are the numbers these are the things this is how you get things changed. Apple does fix bugs depending upon how many people complain. And it's not just, not just how many organizations that buy hardware complain. Google has a lot of weight with Apple, so does Facebook, because they buy a lot of Macs.
Just a little clarification. So if the device is not in MDM yet, and you're going to do an upgrade in place, we would need the end user to sign out of Find My Mac?
Well, okay, a couple things. If your machine's not in an MDM now and you're going to upgrade, you're not going to get the activation lock bypass feature without an MDM. But yeah, basically what's going to happen at that point, if the user isn't signed out of Find My Mac, when they upgrade, the machine will be converted to activation lock tied to their Apple ID. So if that user then leaves the company, then you're stuck. There is an avenue for that, just like there is on iOS. Proof of ownership to an Apple authorized service provider, they can unlock it, but it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
So it's the same avenue it'll be the same thing for macOS. It'll probably just be a learning curve for the stores and the service providers on how to handle it. But always make sure you have proof of purchase. We have time for one more quick question if anybody has anything they want to ask. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference.